Most people shop for food pretty much the same way. They buy what they need for the week, maybe 2 weeks if they're thinking ahead. Fresh food, cold food, convenient food, and then honestly, they just repeat the process again and again without really thinking much about it. But, there's one group that has approached food very differently for decades, not because they were expecting disaster every day, not because they wanted to live in fear, but simply because they believed something straightforward. A household should be able to support itself for a period of time without depending completely on stores staying full. And once you understand how they built that system, well, you start looking at modern shopping very differently. Because most people today don't really store food, they store convenience. That's the difference. So instead of focusing on extreme survival ideas, let's take a look at the food storage system many Mormon families became known for, why it works, and honestly, why people are suddenly paying attention to it again. One of the first things people notice is quantity, not just a few cans, not a tiny emergency kit. We're talking entire shelves, buckets, containers, long-term staples. At first glance it can look kind of excessive, until you realize how the system actually works. Because the goal was never to collect random food, it was to build a structured supply of practical foods that could last a long time and still be useful in everyday life. That's an important difference. A lot of people try to stockpile food by buying random items they never normally eat. Then, years later, it's still just sitting there untouched. That isn't a system. That's really just storage without planning. The Mormon approach focused heavily on foods families already used regularly. Rice, beans, oats, flour, pasta. Just simple staples. Foods that were cheap, filling, and easy to rotate. That's one reason the system lasted. It wasn't disconnected from normal life, it was built into it. Another thing that made this system different was the focus on shelf life. Most modern grocery shopping, as you probably know, revolves around food that expires quickly. Fresh meat, dairy, prepared meals. But long-term food storage works differently. It prioritizes foods that remain usable for years when stored properly. That's why dry goods became such a major part of the system. Large buckets of grains, sealed containers, foods protected from moisture, heat, and air. Because once you remove those threats, certain foods last much longer than people realize. Not forever, of course, but far longer than most modern households are used to thinking about. This is where people often misunderstand the idea completely. They imagine rows of ancient food hidden in a basement. But the real strength wasn't just long storage, it was rotation. Food was constantly used and replaced. Older items moved forward, and newer items moved back. That prevented waste. And it meant families always had something available without relying on last-minute shopping. That's honestly one of the smartest parts of the system, because waste destroys most food storage attempts. People buy too much, forget about it, and then throw it away later. The Mormon system avoided that by making stored food part of normal life. Another major difference was simplicity. A lot of modern food storage advice becomes complicated very quickly. Expensive freeze-dried meals, special gadgets, complicated systems. But many Mormon households focused on extremely basic staples, foods that could combine in multiple ways. Rice with beans, oats with powdered milk, flour for bread. Simple combinations. That simplicity made the system affordable. And affordability is one reason it spread so successfully among ordinary families. Water storage also became part of the conversation. Because food is only half the equation, many households stored water containers alongside food supplies, not because they expected permanent collapse, but because temporary disruptions happen more often than people think. Storms, supply chain delays, weather events. Even short interruptions change how quickly people move through supplies. That's something recent years made very obvious. The moment people think shelves may not stay full, behavior changes instantly, and suddenly, everyone wants the same basics at the same time. That's why simple staples disappear first. One thing that surprises people is how calm the system actually is. It isn't built around panic, it's built around reducing panic. That's an important distinction, because having extra food changes the way people react. When shelves start looking lighter, Most people feel pressure immediately. They rush, they overbuy, they take whatever they can find. But households that already have basic supplies don't react the same way. They have time, and time changes decision-making. There's also a financial side to this that people overlook. Buying shelf-stable staples in larger amounts can reduce costs over time, especially when prices rise unexpectedly. Foods like rice, oats, flour, pasta, and beans are often far cheaper when purchased in bulk. That's another reason these systems lasted for decades. They weren't just practical, they were economical. Another interesting part of the system is how much emphasis was placed on learning practical skills alongside storage. Cooking from basic ingredients, baking bread, using dry goods efficiently, because food storage only works if you know how to use what you store. That's where many people struggle today. Modern shopping is built around convenience, ready-made meals, quick preparation, minimal effort. But basic staples require more involvement. That's why many people buy them, then rarely touch them. This also explains why the system feels unusual to modern audiences. Most households today are designed around constant access, stores nearby, fast delivery, always available supply, so the idea of intentionally keeping months of food at home feels strange. But historically, that wasn't unusual at all. For most of human history, households stored food because they had to. Harvest cycles, winter seasons, supply uncertainty. Long-term storage was normal. Modern convenience changed that mindset. And once convenience becomes normal, dependency becomes invisible. That's the real shift. People stop noticing how often they rely on outside systems continuing to work perfectly. Daily deliveries, constant refrigeration, perfect supply chains, until something interrupts it. Then suddenly the weakness becomes obvious. That's one reason people became more interested in food storage again recently. Not necessarily because they expected extreme situations, but because they saw how quickly normal systems can become strained. And once people see empty shelves even once, they think differently afterwards. Another thing that makes this system effective is emotional stability. That sounds strange at first, but uncertainty affects decision-making. When people feel unprepared, stress increases quickly. Having food available changes that. Even a modest supply creates breathing room, and breathing room matters more than people realize. This doesn't mean every household needs years of food. That's where conversations often become unrealistic. The value is understanding the principles: practical foods, long shelf life, rotation, storage, simple combinations. That's the real system. Because once you understand those principles, you stop buying randomly. You start thinking differently about value, not just what tastes good today, but what remains useful over time. Even small changes make a difference. Keeping extra rice, extra beans, extra canned foods, a little more water, a slightly deeper pantry. That alone creates flexibility most households don't currently have. And flexibility is really what this is about. Not fear, not extreme survival culture. Flexibility, the ability to handle interruptions without immediately feeling pressure. That's why these systems continue to attract attention. Because modern life depends heavily on constant availability. And people are starting to realize how fragile that can feel. Once you notice that, you start paying attention to different things. Which foods disappear first? Which items stay useful longest? Which foods actually make sense to keep around? And suddenly the system stops looking strange. It starts looking practical. That's why many of these food storage ideas survived for generations. Not because they were dramatic, because they worked. Simple systems often do. And maybe that's the most surprising part of all. The foods that matter most usually aren't complicated. They're basic, affordable, easy to overlook. Rice, beans, oats, flour, simple staples quietly doing exactly what they were designed to do. Modern shopping taught people to prioritize convenience, but long-term food storage prioritizes reliability. And those are very different ways of thinking, because when convenience disappears, reliability suddenly matters a lot more.